If you would, go ahead and turn to Genesis chapter 6. We're going to look at several passages as we pass by. I know that you're familiar with the broad contours of the story. We're going to talk about the broad contours of the story and some other things as well. I'll even try to keep an eye on the clock and make sure that we do this right. The truth of the matter is that human beings learn by stories and by example, and you know that. All of you remember the stories that you've heard, and that's why preachers are reluctant to use the same illustrations over and over, because people have long since forgotten the sermons, but they remember the illustrations forever. So you don't want to use those same stories, because that's how people learn, and people have always kind of understood this. One of the most effective techniques for persuasion involves telling stories, models of behavior that you want people to follow. When Plutarch wrote his massive work on the lives of noble Greeks and Romans, when he got to talking about Alexander the Great, part of what he was doing in illuminating the character of Alexander the Great, he pointed out that his intention was to show their character and not their great historical exploits. And so one of the things that he said is, it must be borne in mind that my design is not to write histories, but lives, and the most glorious exploits do not always furnish us with the clearest discoveries of virtue or vice in men, sometimes a matter of less moment, an expression, or a jest informs us better of their characters and inclinations than the most famous sieges, the greatest armaments, or the bloodiest battles whatsoever. Now, the story of Noah tells us something about his character, certainly, but the story of Noah is not given to us primarily to talk to us about Noah. It's primarily to tell us about God. It's a story about God and how God dealt with human beings, and especially with Noah. We owe a great deal of our understanding about the nature of God to Noah's faithful execution of this plan to build an ark in the face of a great flood. Something he'd never seen, something no one had ever seen. Every ancient society has a flood story. It has somewhere in its background a story about a great flood. And it seems that all those tales are rooted in some dim historical memory. Even if they don't pay attention to the Word of God, they have some sort of dim historical memory about the great flood. And the flood has captured the imagination of every child who ever thought it'd be great to be on a floating zoo for a year. That'd be the most marvelous fun, wouldn't it? I heard about a little boy who went to his grandfather and he said, "Grandpa," he just heard the story in Vacation Bible School or something. He came to his grandpa and he said, "Grandpa, were you on the ark?" The grandfather said, "No, I wasn't on the ark." And that confused his grandson. He looked at him and said, "Then how come you didn't drown?" He knew for sure he was that old. Should have been there. Hollywood now has made this whole cluster of movies that twist the truth of the flood into some sensationalistic kind of circus. We don't really have time to examine in detail Genesis chapters 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, but I do want to sketch out the broad contours of the story with you, and I do want to refer to several of the passages. Let's first of all talk about some of the broad contours, because the entire event has its roots in the condition of the world at that time. The most telling comments are in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, and also in verse 11. So the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. What a terrible thing to say about human beings. All they ever thought about was evil. You can imagine they're lying on their beds and they're dreaming of, oh, what terrible thing can we do tomorrow? And they just sing themselves to sleep with these songs about how they'll rise up and do evil in the morning. In verse 11, it says, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence." And then in Genesis chapter 6, verse 11 and verse 12, and then also in verse 13 and verse 17, this word corrupt or corruption comes up over and over. So in verse 12, he says, God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. In verse 13, God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. And the word destroy is the word corrupt. I'm going to take it, I'm going to break it down and make it what it shouldn't be here. In verse 17, he says, I'm going to bring flood waters on the earth to destroy. There's that same word again, to corrupt. I'm going to destroy all life under heavens, every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish. And then in verse 8 and verse 9, we have a wonderful statement about Noah. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And then in verse 9 it says, this is the account of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. That phrase, he walked with God, had only appeared one time before, and it described Enoch, his great-grandfather, whom he had never met. Enoch was long gone by the time Noah came on the surface of the earth. But only Enoch had it been said that he walked with God. And now here's Noah walking with God. Now, in order to execute God's justice, he first requires Noah to build an ark. An ark is a box. It's not a boat. And if you look at the pictures, the artist renditions of an ark, it'll always look like a giant ship with a great keel in it. And that's not what an ark is. An ark is just a box. You've got the Ark of the Covenant. It's a box that is put together to hold certain special, you got the pot of manna, and you've got the table of the law written by the finger of God, and you've got Aaron's rod in the Ark of the Covenant. It's just a box, and it's just a box. This is some box. This is a big box, but that's what he's called to build. Has very explicit dimensions, very explicit materials, a very required technique, an explicit deck plan in the box, along with a passenger and a cargo manifest. Let's work through some of these details. If you skip down to verse 18, God says he will make a covenant with Noah. I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. I was intrigued by Dale Hartman's statement in the previous lecture when he said he always looked to find out where the first mention of things, where's the first mention of holy, where's the first mention of love. This is the first mention of the word covenant in the Bible. And so God is going to make a covenant with Noah. There's never been anything like that before either, so he's going to make a covenant with Noah. Let's go ahead and talk about some of the practical details of building the box. It's supposed to be made of gopher wood. The old joke is that he had his boys go for wood. It's terrible, isn't it? You shouldn't do that this time of day. Nevertheless, what is gopher wood? And the answer is nobody knows. That's a transliteration of the actual Hebrew word, which is, are you ready for this? Gopher. We don't know what it is. And it's translated in different ways in different readings of the Bible. Nobody really understands what it is. In my view, cypress is a lousy translation. If you've been around cypress wood at all, it is really heavy and probably will sink. The reason they choose that is because it doesn't rot. Look, the thing's only got to last 1 year and 10 days. I don't think rot is going to be a big problem with this. Buoyancy would be a problem. We want this thing to float, okay? So God has him made it. It's going to be made of gopher wood. It's going to have rooms in it. It's going to be caulked with pitch. That's tar. Could be pine tar or something like that, but it's pitch inside and out, and that's for waterproofing purposes. It makes perfect sense. It's going to be 300 by 50 by 30 cubits. Now, a cubit obviously is the measurement from your elbow to your fingertip. So how long is that? 1.5 feet nominally. So some versions will go ahead and translate that out 450 feet by 75 by 45. Well, okay. I don't know. How big was Noah? That's the big question, because that would be his cubit that we're using for a measurement. It's big, okay? This is a big box. It's big. It's going to be roofed. It's going to be finished within a cubit of the top. Presumably that's going to be space for ventilation. When I was a child, my mother gave me a little white King James Version Bible. It was red letter edition, and it had about 6 color pictures in there, and one of the pictures was Noah. And in the ark, there was this little tiny window in the side. And I really don't think that's how it came out. I think that thing went all the way around the box there, so you get some ventilation and some air in there. It's funny, you get some wrong perception stuck in your mind after you see the artwork that someone imagines about how this works. It's supposed to have a door in the side. The door in the side is brilliant. We presume that's for loading and unloading of the animals and the people. It's fascinating that God specifies that the door must be in the side. Do we have any former sailors here? Anybody seagoing services? Okay. You're going to understand this instantly, because when the door goes in the side, the water pressure actually pushes the door in harder and keeps it sealed. It's a brilliant nautical thing to do. Good shipbuilding technique if we were building a ship. So the door is going to be fixed in place as long as the ark is afloat. When it comes to rest on the land, that kind of tension is broken then, and the door can open more easily. It's going to have 3 decks. We got a lot of animals. We got to get a lot of things in this box. So we need 3 decks so that all the animals can be saved. And we've got 7 pairs of clean animals and 2 of unclean, male and female, along with food for them all. And also you've got Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives. And it's very interesting that there's already a distinction that's made between clean animals and unclean, and we don't have a law yet. But we already know what the clean animals are and what the unclean animals are. Apparently, God is in conversation with Noah and lets him know what the clean animals are and the unclean animals. So, the law is going to come. This is one model builder's representation of the construction of the ark. It's the best picture I could pick off of the web. I'm sorry, it's a little blurry. It's a box, okay? That's the thing that he got right. I really like that. It's a box. It's a big box, but it's a box. And that's just a computer-generated graphic that a fella put together. So, the wonderful thing, of course, is Genesis 6:22. Noah did everything just as God commanded him. And that's the big operative phrase in the entire story. Noah did everything just as God commanded him. In verse 5 of chapter 7, Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. It's so important for him to be completely obedient to God. So, he's done everything that he's supposed to do, and God gathered all the animals to the ark. Noah didn't have to go out and trap them and drag them back in a net or in a box and stick them inside. No, God brought the animals to him, and they all got into the box, and after they got in, God closed the door. I think that's really interesting and very important. God closed the door of the box, and the rains came. In verse 16 of chapter 7, the animals going in were male and female of every living thing as God had commanded Noah. Then the Lord shut him in. And what God did then was he simply undid day 2 of creation. Day 2 of creation, God had separated the waters that are above the firmament from the waters that are below the firmament. And all he did was take the firmament away. And he allowed the waters to come back together and completely inundate the earth. The rains came, springs opened, the waters rose 40 days, covered every part of the land for 150 days. The timing, the dating on this is very explicit, about 40 days of rain, 150 days the waters continued to rise. The total time is 1 year and 10 days. Make no mistake, this is a historical reality, and God expects us to understand that God is working this, and it's a year and 10 days that all this takes place. And yet, God remembered Noah. And that's chapter 8, verse 1. God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. That is a very powerful statement, that God remembered Noah. It's a key statement that shows up from time to time in the Bible to demonstrate that God is taking notice of what's going on, and he's going to act in a very powerful way. God remembered Noah. God remembered the Israelites. You remember the story in Exodus as new Pharaoh has come to the throne, does not remember Joseph and what he'd done, and the people are suffering and groaning under their bondage. They have a very, very bad life. They're now forced to throw their baby boys into the river, and they're crying out for help, and God remembered his people. And that means he's going to act. And he's going to act in a very, very powerful way to bring about rescue for them. So, God's going to intervene, and he has restored the earth, and so he calls Noah and the animals to come out in chapter 8 and verse 16. Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives, and bring out the animals and so on, every living creature with you. And so they come out after the flood. They release the animals, and immediately Noah worships God, builds an altar, offers a sacrifice, and in response to that act of worship, God declares his will now, a new will for the people of God, for all of the earth, in fact. He promises never to destroy the earth in that way. He institutes fear and dread of human beings within the animals, because now they're food for humans. They weren't food before, but now they are. And so human life is especially honored. If human life is taken, a life must be forfeited, and the humans are then to spread across the earth. And it's immediately after that declaration, then, that God institutes this very first covenant. A covenant is a binding agreement that defines a relationship. And except for a very specialized use in legal matters today, we don't use the word covenant very often. The closest thing that we have in our normal society to a covenant is not really a contract, but a marriage. In a contract, if you go down and buy a car, you agree to pay a certain amount for it, and you're going to often make payments every month. And if you don't make the payments, there's a provision in the contract that they come and get your car. There are all kinds of agreements that we make that have if-then clauses. When I first got out of high school, I went to college, and I had a full scholarship to Central State University. It's now UCO, University of Central Oklahoma. Did you know that if you don't keep a 2.5 grade point average, they'll take your scholarship? Do you realize that? I had a wonderful time. They took my scholarship. Okay, right. That was the agreement that we had made. Okay. A covenant doesn't have any provisions for failure. A covenant is simply an agreement that defines a relationship. And so in a marriage, you have a man and a woman who want to be married, and they come to me and they say, we want to be married. I don't doubt their love for each other. I don't doubt their commitment to each other, but they're not married yet. They come up before me and everyone else, and they make those vows to each other. He says, I do. She says, I do. Now they're married. They're in a covenant relationship, and there is no if-then provision. You've just made this covenant. You're in this relationship. And that's what God has done for the very first time. And there are terms, there are characteristics of covenants that we see in the Bible, and some of the characteristics are listed here. You have parties who are involved in the covenant. So who's involved here? In this covenant, this is unique because God unilaterally binds himself. He has decided to make a covenant with humanity, and in fact with the earth. He just binds himself. There are no terms for the earth to follow. There are no requirements that Noah and his family have in order to maintain the covenant. It's just that God has bound himself to them in this covenant. Now we have terms. This party will do this party will do that. God names his terms in this. He requires nothing of Noah. He requires nothing of the rest of the living things, but he does make promises. And that's a part of a covenant. He makes promises, and his promise is, never again will there be a flood to destroy all living things on the earth. And there is a sign of covenants. There are 5 major covenants in the Bible. I know you guys probably know this stuff very well. There are 5 major covenants. All of them have these characteristics, and some of them have additional characteristics as well. Things like an annual remembrance or a periodic remembrance of the covenant. But each covenant has a sign of the covenant to remind the parties this covenant is in place. And so the big sign of the covenant is the rainbow. So those are the broad contours of the story. Now I want to go down and take a look at some of the details that are involved in the story. I want to look at some of the important details. And we're going to start with the man Noah himself. He is truly a heroic character for a lot of reasons. He's a true pioneer. He had no example of obedience before him. This is what is odd to me, and one of the first things that I noticed when I started working this. If you go back to chapter 5, Genesis chapter 5 and verse 30. After Noah was born, Lamech, that's his father, Lamech lived 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Lamech lived 777 years, and then he died. He had other sons and daughters, yet none of them were saved on the ark. It doesn't say anywhere in the Scriptures that they walked with God. It's entirely likely that they were ungodly people, just as those who were characterized as every imagination of the thoughts of their heart was evil only all the time. There was no pattern, apparently, in Noah's life. When God gave Noah the pattern for the ark, Noah built it just as he'd been instructed to do. Now, it seems kind of a simple thing for us to look at that and say, well, yeah, what else would you do? You're told to build the ark, and you've got a pattern for it, you've got a blueprint, you're going to follow it, right? Well, it seems obvious, and yet there are things that look simple at first to us only because we've been trained to think in a particular way. When Christopher Columbus returned from his first voyage, he was at a dinner that was honoring him. A lot of nobles were there, and there was this snarky young dandy sitting across the table from him who frankly didn't think much of what Columbus had accomplished. And so he kind of sneered, because most people actually did believe that the earth was round. And so he kind of sneered at Columbus and he said, "Isn't it true that anyone could have done what you did?" And Columbus just looked at him for a moment and kind of smiled. And there was a bowl of hard-boiled eggs in the center of the table with all the other food. And Columbus reached over and got one of the eggs and he held it up. And he said, "Can you stand an egg on its end so that it doesn't fall over? Can you balance an egg?" And the young man reached over and he took one of the hard-boiled eggs and he put it on the table, balanced it, let it go, it fell over. He picked it up and tried it, fell over again. He picked it up, and someone else reached over and got an egg and tried it, and it fell over. And pretty soon there are eggs rolling all over the table as people are trying. I'm sure I can do that. And Columbus watched that for a little while, reached over and took a hard-boiled egg and put it on the table and went pop and just dimpled the shell and let it go, and it stood up perfectly. And he looked across the table and he said, "Nothing is easier when once I've shown the way." So we look at Noah and we think about he did everything that the Lord commanded. And it seems so simple to us, but that's because Noah has showed us the way. We have all these stories of people who have showed us the way of being perfectly obedient. He's shown us the way that it's done. Now let's talk about the plan that God has. We talked about the man Noah and his obedience. God has decided to judge the earth. This is God's decision, not any human's decision. God has decided to judge the earth, and He's decided to do it by the very simple expedient of undoing His creation. It's His creation. He can do or undo as He chooses. And as I said, He's just going to remove the firmament that separated the waters above from the waters below and allow all the waters to come back together again. If you go to chapter 7, verse 11 and 12, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. He just removed the expanse that had separated the waters and allowed them to come together again, inundated all the dry land, and everything that lived on the surface of the land was also flooded. God chose to condemn the wicked, and He chose to use the righteous to do it. Noah built the ark according to God's specifications and His instructions, but it was God who shut the door. It was God who put His people inside and closed the door so that the wicked remained outside. Those who loved violence and corruption were left outside with no remedy at all. Noah judged nobody. God judged everybody. And that's the way it should be. And after the flood, God's plan was for man and the animals to leave the ark and repopulate the earth and spread across this newly exposed land that's out there. And the result of the flood is a completely different world. Everything has changed. And after the flood, everything changed around Noah. Rain existed. It hadn't existed before, just a mist that came up and watered the ground. People could eat meat. Before that, apparently humans were vegetarians. And now animals are given for food. The animals would dread and avoid mankind as a result of that. And the death penalty was established because human life is different. Human life is fundamentally different on the earth. And God established this covenant with the world. There's a guy named Perry Miller who wrote that with a covenant, you no longer have a distant God, you have a God on whom you can count. You have a God who has entered into a special arrangement with you. And I think he's exactly right. God is not at a distance from us. He's made a covenant with us, and so He's close at hand. God had promised Noah a covenant before the flood ever began, and He fulfilled His promise after everybody's released because God keeps His promises. God keeps His promises always. And while everything changed around man, nothing changed within man. Nothing changed. He was still wicked and corrupt and prone to violence. In chapter 8, verse 21, the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in His heart, never again will I curse the ground because of man, even though every inclination of his heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. The Russian Alexander Solzhenitsyn came out of the Soviet gulags back in the 70s and was allowed to come to the United States. He's a world-famous author even at that point, smuggled out his writings from the labor camps in Siberia. After he came to the United States, he wrote a lot of other things, and one of the things that he wrote, he talked about his experience, how he came to be sentenced to the labor camps to begin with. And what had happened was he had made some unguarded comments to a very close friend of his, and the close friend betrayed him. Called the secret police. The next thing you know, he's dragged into a tribunal and sentenced without a real trial and exiled for over a decade. He said at first he was very bitter toward his friend. He thought about what a terrible man he was and how he had betrayed him and how he wanted God to eliminate the wicked, get rid of just draw a line and put all the good people on one side and all the wicked people on the other side and get rid of all the wicked people and there would only be good people left. And he said the longer I pondered that, the longer I thought about it, the more I realized that line between good and evil runs through every human heart. That's the problem. And that's why nothing has changed within man. Everything changed around man as a result of the flood. Nothing changed within man. The world is different. The people are not different. What I want to do real quickly as we wind this up, I actually am keeping an eye on the clock. I thought I'd get an amen on it. Never mind. So how does this obedience of Noah furnish a pattern for the future? Over and over and over, Noah is referenced by the biblical writers. So Isaiah points to this event as a great example of God's gracious covenant with people, provides life to all, and promise of grace in Isaiah 54 and verse 9. In Ezekiel chapter 14, Noah is held up as an example of righteousness along with Job and Daniel. You may remember God speaking to Ezekiel says, even if those three were here, that their righteousness would only save them. It wouldn't save anyone else. Jesus himself used Noah as the prototypical example of sudden judgment because people were just going about their lives, and they probably, if any of them knew what Noah was up to, they probably thought he was crazy. He's building this huge box. What's that all about? And all of his speaking to them about life and the flood, the coming rain, they disregarded all of it. And that one day, the door was shut and the rains came. And Jesus used that example as a perfect example of that sudden catastrophe that will come. And Peter uses this, of course, as an analogy to our own salvation through baptism in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20 and 21. And many of the early church fathers picked up that same imagery and talked about how we are saved through water, and we're in the boat. We're in the boat with Noah. But it really is a story about God. And it always has been a story about God. We get so focused on the details of the ark and the floating zoo, and we talk about how God brought this about and what was happening. We forget to talk about God. What's happening in God? And what does this tell us about God? First of all, it tells us that God has a standard of righteousness. And we fail to meet it. Sin has consequences, and God will not forever overlook the corruption and the sin that we unleash on His good creation. He may forbear for a time, but He will not forever overlook it. It also tells us that God has a plan to redeem and to restore and to reclaim what has been ruined by our sin, what has been corrupted, damaged and twisted. And that plan depends on the obedience of human beings. And yeah, every detail is important. God cares about the details. You can speculate all you like. Well, if Noah had cheated a little on the size of the ark, because it's a lot of work to build a box that size, would it still have floated? If he had chosen a different kind of wood, would it still have floated? The answer is beyond us. We have no idea whether it would or not. All the salvation was by God's grace. All we know is that Noah did what he was commanded to do. And apparently every detail was important to God. That's why He gave all those details. So we have details about God's plan to redeem and restore and reclaim us. I think every detail is important about that. I think when He says we need to hear the Word of God and we need to confess Christ, and yeah, we need to repent, stop doing the wrong thing, start doing the right thing. We need to be baptized. I think that's really, really important. And I think all of those details are a part of God's plan to redeem and restore us. It also tells us that God is always faithful to the obedient. He doesn't forget His promises. He fulfills every pledge He's ever made to us. There was at least a year and 10 days between the time God promised that He would make a covenant with Noah and the time He actually made the covenant with Noah. And yet, God kept His promise. God promised a new covenant in Jeremiah 31. It's about 600 years later that He made that new covenant in Christ. To us, 600 years seems like a terribly long time. And if you were stuck in a box with all those animals, I think a year and 10 days would seem like a very long time. But God still remembers His promises, and He keeps all of His promises. And finally, it tells us that God binds Himself by covenant to human beings. He made a covenant with Noah that set the pattern for future covenants through Abraham and Moses and David and even Jesus Christ Himself. So we have this pattern for covenants that God sets up through His grace, His mercy, and His goodness. But from the very beginning, Noah is showing us the way by just being obedient to God. Now, I'm going to quit here just in a few minutes here. What does Noah's example of obedience do for us? What does that give us? Noah was not the first to walk with God. He wasn't the first. Enoch was actually the first to be said that he walked with God. But he's the first to show us what that kind of obedience looked like. All we get is the bare statement with Enoch that he walked with God. We don't see in what way he walked with God. With Noah, we get a picture of how he walked with God. He was obedient in every way to God's plan. So those who came behind him were able to imitate his obedience and continue that kind of faithfulness to God. And the great heroes of faith that you read about in Hebrews chapter 11, all these great heroes of faith, and Abraham and Moses and Elijah and David and all the others continued to walk that path of obedience, that trail that had kind of been blazed by Noah. He was the first one who did everything that God said to do. In the ancient world, you have roads like this. This is actually a picture that I took of an ancient Roman road in Galilee. And they lay these beautiful stones down. The Roman soldiers had to be busy doing something. They laid down these beautiful Roman roads, and the first few vehicles that went across there didn't even leave a mark. It's stone. I mean, this is really a hard surface. And then after a while, the vehicles kept going, and they started wearing out little marks and ruts. And finally, you get deep ruts like this in the stone. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of wagons going over those roads have chewed out those ruts. And it's easy to follow then. It's easy to know where the road is going then, because the ruts tell you. You have all these faithful marks of obedience in front of us. And because of people like Abraham and Hannah and Ruth and Daniel and Paul, we find it easier to obey the Lord because they have followed in Noah's example of obedience. And consequently, we learn to trust God. God has a plan for obedience, a plan for salvation for those who will believe and obey Him. You know that. And the plan calls for our cooperation and our trust. We have to do what God commands us to do and trust that He will do what He promises to do. The plan is very specific. The plan is that we're going to pass through water because we know that God is faithful and that He keeps His covenant and He keeps His promises to those who will obey Him. And we can wait for that final and ultimate fulfillment of the covenant that He has made with us. This time He's taken the life of the righteous one as a ransom for the wicked and ungrateful. Do you remember that passage? God is kind to the wicked and ungrateful. So, like Noah, we can get in the box when it's time. And God will shut us in. And we can be confident of His grace and His goodness, knowing that when the time is right, He'll say, "Come out to a new heavens and a new earth, the home of righteousness."